Every meeting has its one problem. You discuss 10 things, make 3 decisions, casually mention 5 follow ups, and everyone leaves the call thinking, okay, we know what to do. But 2 days later, nobody knows who was supposed to do what. The transcripts are somewhere in Google Docs or Notions. The action items are mixed inside the discussion. Some tasks have no owner, some have no deadline, and some are not even clearly written as tasks. Honestly, this is where a lot of work really dies. Hi, my name is Mahadev, and I specialize in building AI powered automation workflows that turn messy, unstructured data into reliable, actionable systems. In this video, I'll walk you through how I designed and build one of these systems step by step, specifically a workflow that takes messy meeting transcripts, extracts decisions and action items using AI, and sends them to human review queue and only creates final tasks after the approval. The important part is I'm not building this as a fully autonomous task creator that blindly pushes everything into Notion. This, while that sounds cool in a demo, but in real life it is very risky. Instead, I'm building a human in the loop workflow. AI does the heavy lifting, extraction, structuring, checking what is missing, drafting class clarifications, etc. But a human still approves, edits, rejects, and asks for clarification before anything becomes a real task. This video will have 3 parts. First, I'll break down the product requirements like a mini PRD. Second, I'll show the build in NA10 and explain the key workflow decisions, assumptions, and trade-offs. Third, I'll run a demo with a few test cases, a clean action item, a missing owner, a vague deadline, a non-task discussion, an approved task, and a rejected task. So let's start with the product breakdown. Let's start with understanding the problem I'm trying to solve. Most teams already capture meeting transcripts in some form. It could be manual transcripts, Google Docs, Notion pages, a meeting transcript tool, or even just a messy dump of discussion points. But the problem is not capturing the transcripts. The real problem is converting those transcripts into clean, trackable work. Because meeting transcripts are usually written in discussion language, not task language. People say things like, let's look into this next week. We should update the onboarding flow. Someone from marketing can follow up. Before the next review, let's check the numbers. Now, as humans, we understand that these are probably action items, but they are not clean tasks yet. Tasks needs to have clear title, an owner, a deadline, priority, and enough context so that the person receiving it knows what to do. And that conversion step is usually manual. Someone has to read the transcripts, interpret the discussion, separate decisions from general conversation, identify action items, assign owners, estimate deadlines, and then copy everything into Notion, Asana, Trello, or Jira. That manual step creates a few problems. First, it takes time. Second, important action items get missed. Third, people make assumptions about ownership and deadlines. Fourth, tasks are created inconsistently. And fifth, if something is unclear, the clarification happens outside the workflow, usually through email or chat, which creates even more context switching. So, the goal of this project is simple. Can I build an AI powered workflow that turns messy meeting transcripts into structured task suggestions, but still keeps the human in control?
So, who is this workflow for? The target users for the workflow are people who spend a lot of time in meetings and are responsible for making sure things actually get done afterwards. Think founders, product managers, project managers, operators, consultants, executive assistants, or even small teams. Basically, anyone who runs into the problem where a meeting happened, decisions were made, follow ups were discussed, and now someone has to turn all of that into real actionable tasks. This workflow is especially helpful for them when meeting transcripts are very messy or unstructured. In other words, they are not already neatly written as tasks. For example, a transcript might say, "We decided to improve the onboarding email sequence because users are dropping off after sign up. Priya will check the current flow and share findings next week or next Friday." That single sentence actually contains a lot of information: a decision, a reason, an owner, an action, and a deadline. A human can read that and turn it into task pretty easily. But the goal here is to make that happen automatically, or at least with minimal effort. Ideally, the AI would pull out task name, which is review onboarding email sequence, owner Priya, deadline would be next Friday, context would be users are dropping off after sign up, decision summary would be improve onboarding email sequence. Priority may be medium or high depending on the context. Clarification required? No, because there's enough information already. Now compare that to something like this. Someone should check the onboarding emails soon. In this case, workflow shouldn't just go ahead and create a task, because who is someone, and what does soon actually mean, and what exactly needs to be checked? So instead, it should be flagged as needs clarification. That's really the core idea behind this product. Clear tasks move forward, unclear ones get paused, and humans step in to approve the final creation. Now let's translate this into product requirements in a clear, structured way. The workflow should accept structured meeting transcripts as input. For this version, transcripts are extracted from Google Sheets. Once transcripts are received, the workflow should use AI to extract structured information. The AI should identify key decisions, action items, task name, owners, deadline, priority, context, missing information, ambiguous information, source or decision reference. After extraction, the workflow should validate the AI output. This step is necessary because AI output can be inconsistent. Even when requesting structured formats like JSON, the system must verify that the format is valid, required fields are present, and each action item is appropriate to convert into task. Following the validation, the workflow should classify each item. Each item can be categorized as ready for review, needs clarification, invalid task, not a task, no task found. For the current version, the primary states are ready for review, needs clarification, approved, rejected, and created. The workflow should not automatically create tasks from all extracted items. Instead, it should send task suggestions to a Notion review queue. In this review queue, a human reviewer can inspect the task, edit the task name, update the owner, modify the deadline, adjust priority, approve the task, reject the task, request clarification, etc. Once a task is approved, a separate workflow should create the final task in Notion task database. After creation, the system should update the original review item and log the event in Google Sheets. The requirement is not simply AI creates tasks. The requirement is AI extracts and structures task suggestions, a human reviews and approves them, automation creates the final task, and all key actions are logged. This reflects how the system would operate in a real business environment. Now, let me walk you through how I scoped this problem. When you are building automation projects, especially AI ones, it is really easy to go overboard. You might start with something simple like turning meeting transcripts into tasks, and before you know it, you're thinking about Google Docs inputs, Slack notifications, Jira integrations, duplicate detection, summary dashboards, recurring syncs, permissions, and a bunch of different destinations. That's usually where things start to stall. So instead, I broke everything down into releases. In the version 1 release, the goal was to just prove the core idea. Could I take meeting transcripts, send them to OpenAI, and get structured JSON back, validate it, and create a task in Notion? That version showed that the basic engine works, but it also had a flaw. It could create tasks too early. There wasn't much in the way of human review. So in the version 2, I added a proper human in the loop step. Now, task suggestions go into a Notion review queue first. From there, the user can edit, approve, or reject them. Only approved tasks actually get created. If something's unclear, it gets routed for clarification, and Google Sheets is used for logging everything. That's the version I'm focusing on in this video. Then there is version 3, where things can really expand. That could include Google Docs as input, multiple destinations like Asana, Trello, or Jira, duplicate detection, meeting summaries, better priority estimations, stronger source, references, more robust audits, and improved error handling. But for this build, I am intentionally keeping things tight, using Google Sheets to trigger transcript input, OpenAI extraction, Notion review queue, approval based task creation, clarification handling, rejection handling, and Google Sheets logging. That's more than enough to make the workflow useful without overcomplicating it.
Now let's discuss the system design. The system has three main workflows. First up is the extraction to review queue workflow. This is where meeting transcripts come in. The workflow takes those transcripts, sends them to the AI model, gets back structured task suggestions, then passes and validates the output. After that, it routes each item based on whether it's clear or unclear. Clear items go into the nation review queue with a status like review pending. Unclear items go into the review queue but with status like needs clarification. It can also draft a clarification email and log the event in Google Sheets. Next is the approved task processor workflow. This one kicks in when a human approves a task in the review queue. It picks up the approved item, checks that a final task hasn't already been created, prepares the final Notion task payload, creates the task in destination database, updates the review item, and logs the task creation in Google Sheets. Then there's the rejection handling workflow. This runs when the human rejects a task. It captures the rejection reason, logs it in Google Sheets, and updates the original review item so that the rejected task is clearly marked as closed. So instead of building one big workflow that does everything, I broke it into smaller pieces. That makes the system easier to understand, easier to debug, and safer overall. Extraction is one workflow. Approval based creation is another workflow. Rejection handling is another workflow. This separation ended up being one of the most important product decisions in this build. So, to sum it all up, the core principle of this workflow is AI suggests, human decides, and automation executes. That is the safest version of this product because AI is very good at reading messy text and extracting structure, but AI should not always decide whether something is truly a task, whether the owner is correct, or whether vague deadline should become a real due date. That is why this workflow has a human review queue. The goal is not to remove humans from the process. The goal is to remove the boring manual work around reading transcripts, extracting action items, rewriting tasks, and copying data between tools. The human still controls the important decisions. That's the product breakdown. And now let's move into the build. Now I'm going to walk through the build inside N8N. I'll walk through the workflow structure first, and then I'll go node by node and explain what each part is doing. At a high level, I have three workflows. The first one is the main extraction workflow. The second one is the approved task processor workflow. And the third one is the rejection handling workflow. I'm going to start with the extraction workflow because that is where the meeting transcripts enters the system. This first workflow is called the extraction to review queue workflow. The purpose of this workflow is to take raw transcripts and convert them into reviewable task suggestions. The trigger can be a webhook, a manual trigger, or eventually a Google Sheets trigger. For the demo, I'm using a controlled input because I want to test specific meeting transcript examples. In a more production-like setup, this could be triggered when a new row is added to the Google Sheets. For example, the sheet could have columns like meeting ID, meeting title, date, transcripts, participants, source link, and status. When a new transcript is added, the row is selected and Process Meeting Notes button is clicked, and the N8N workflow picks it up via webhook and starts the workflow. The first important node after the trigger is the input preparation step. Here, I clean up the incoming fields and make sure the AI receives the right context. I want to pass not just the raw transcripts, but also some metadata if available: meeting title, meeting date, participants, and source. This matters because deadlines and ownership often depend on surrounding context, and adding the context helps the system interpret ambiguous statements more accurately while making it easier to resolve unclear tasks during the clarification step. For example, if the transcript says next Friday, the meeting date helps interpret that. If the transcript mentions Priya, the participants list helps confirm she was part of the meeting. For this MVP, I'm not doing this advanced ambiguity resolution yet, but I'm keeping the structure ready for it. Next is the OpenAI node. This is where the raw meeting transcripts are converted into structured output. The prompt is very important here. I don't want the model to simply summarize the meeting. I want it to extract decisions and action items. So the prompt tells the model something like, you are an assistant that extracts actionable tasks from meeting transcripts, identify decisions, and related action items. For each action item, return task name, owner, deadline, priority, context, missing fields, clarification required, and source references. Do not invent owners or deadlines. If something is unclear, mark it as clarification required. Return valid JSON only because the next node needs to pass this output. One of the biggest issues in AI automation is that people treat AI output as it is already reliable. But in workflows, AI output is just another input. You still need validation. So, after an OpenAI node, I use a code node. This code node parses the AI response and validates the structure. Th- this step does a few important things. First, it checks whether the model actually returned a JSON. Second, it flattens the data. The, the AI might return decisions. Inside each decision, there might be multiple action items. But for the review queue, I want each action item to become one review item. So the code node flattens the nested decisions and actions into individual task records. Third, it classifies each item. For example, if a task has a task name, owner, deadline, and enough context, it can be marked as ready for review. If the owner is missing, it becomes a needs clarification task. If the deadline is vague, it can also become a needs clarification, or it can still go into review with ambiguity flagged. If the task is just a general discussion and not an action item, it should not become a final task. This is where the deterministic logic matters. The AI extracts, but the code node enforces the workflow rules. This is one of the trade offs I made intentionally. I don't want the AI deciding the whole workflow. The AI gives structured suggestions. The innate in logic decides routing. That makes the system more predictable. After passing and validation, the workflow goes into an F mode. This is where I split the path. If task is clear enough, it goes into the review pending path. If the task is missing the information, it goes into the needs clarification path. This is an important product decision. I could have chosen to create draft tasks for unclear items, but I don't want unclear work to pollute the final task database. So instead, unclear items stay in the review queue. They're visible, but they're not treated as final tasks. That gives the user a place to fix them. For example, if the task says update report soon, but the owner is missing, the workflow does not create a task assigned to nobody. It creates a review item with a missing owner flagged. Then the user can add the owner or send a clarification email. This is much safer. The next step is creating the review item in Notion. This is the Notion review queue is basically the human approval interface. For each extracted task suggestion, I'm storing fields like task name, owner, deadline, priority, context, decision summary, missing information, clarification required, review status, source reference, created task link, rejection reason, etc. The reason I use Notion here is that it's easy to edit. The user does not need to go into N8N to approve a task. They just can open the review queue, inspect the extracted task, fix anything that is wrong, and change the review status. That is the important UX decision. A workflow is only useful if the human review step is convenient. If the review step is buried inside N8N, most non-technical users will not use it. But if it is in Notion, it feels like a normal task review database. For this build, the statuses are something like review pending, needs clarification, approved, rejected, created, etc. Now let's look at the clarification path. If the task is missing owner, deadline, priority, or context, the workflow creates a review item with needs clarification. It also prepares a clarification email draft. For example, the draft may say, "Hi, I reviewed the meeting transcripts and found that the owner and the deadline are unclear. Can you confirm who should own this and when it should be completed?" The important thing is that the workflow does not send this email automatically. It only drafts it. This is another human in the loop choice. Why? Because clarification emails can be sensitive. Maybe the wording should be adjusted. Maybe the person asking wants to add context. Maybe they don't want to send an email at all and prefer Slack or a quick call. So the automation prepares the draft, but the human decides whether to send it or how to send it. This is the same principle again. AI suggests, human decides, and automation executes. The next important piece is logging. I'm using Google Sheets as a simple audit log. For this MVP, Google Sheets is not the main product interface. It is more like a test run and audit layer. It helps me track events like review item created, clarification required, tasks created, tasks rejected, workflow error if added later. This is useful during the build because I can compare test runs. For example, if I run the same meeting transcript multiple times, after changing the prompt, I can see whether the extracted tasks improved. It also gives me an evidence for debugging. So now let's start with the cleanest test case, that is the onboarding flow review test case. The transcript says the team reviewed the new user onboarding flow and agreed that the sign-up drop-off is too high. The decision is to improve the onboarding email sequence. Then the transcript says the Priya will review the current onboarding emails and share the recommendation by Friday. It also says that the priority is high because it affects the activation. So this is a very clean task. It has clear action, it has a clear owner, it has a clear deadline and the context, and the priority is also clearly defined. So the expected result is simple. The workflow should create one review item in Notion with status review pending. It should not create the final task yet. That is important. At this stage, I only want a task suggestion, not a final task. Let's go back to the N81 workflow and execute the workflow. And then let's come back and select this row and press on the process meeting notes. Now the workflow execution has been submitted. The workflow is executing, and you can see that the workflow picks a meeting transcript, sends it to the OpenAI extraction node, receives structured JSON, and then passes the output into the validation logic. The code node checks whether the task has the required information. In this case, everything important is present, so the item should go down the review pending path. Now, let's check the Notion review queue database, and here we can see that the review item has been created, and the task is about reviewing the onboarding email sequence. Yeah, owner is Priya, and the deadline is the Friday of 18th March 2024, and the priority is high, and The review status is pending. Clarification required is no. So this is the ideal happy path. The AI has done the extraction work, but the workflow has not blindly created the final task, and the task is waiting for human review. This is the exact behavior I want. Now let's test a messy test case, which is the analytics dashboard discussion. Um, in this test case, the transcript says that we need a better visibility into weekly product usage. Someone should create a dashboard for activation, retention, and feature adoption soon. This sounds like a useful action item, but there are two problems. First, the owner is missing. It says someone. The second issue is that the deadline is vague. It says soon. So this should not become a final task, ideally. I do not want the AI to guess the owner. I do not want the workflow to create a task with a vague deadline. The expected result is that one review item should be created in Notion with status needs clarification. Missing information should include owner and deadlines, and no final task should be created at the moment. Now, let me run through the workflow quickly and execute the process meeting notes for this particular test case. Yeah, the execution is successful. So the workflow picks up the uh, transcript and goes through the needs clarification pathway. And the AI should be able to extract the task idea. The task idea is to create a dashboard for activation, retention, and the feature adoption. But after extraction, the validation logic should detect that the owner and deadline are not good enough. And this is where the workflow becomes more useful than a simple AI prompt. The AI extracts, but the workflow decides whether the extracted item is ready for review or needs clarification. Now let's go to the Notion review queue or task review queue database and see that the item has been created. Yes, the create dashboard activation has been created for retention and feature adoption. Yeah, this task has been created, and we can see that the priority is unknown, the owner is unknown, and the deadline is unknown. The context is there, the decision summary is there, and we can see that the review status designated for this is needs clarification, and the clarification required is checked. The missing information is the owner and deadline. The clarification questions would be who will own the creation of the dashboard and what is the deadline for completing the dashboard. Now, one thing I wanted to show you in this workflow is in the needs clarification part of this workflow is that an email is drafted and waiting for human approval to send it to the team to clarify for the missing information or the ambiguous information. So over here you can see that the email body is saying that I'm converting the meeting notes into follow-up tasks and I need clarification on one item. I need clarification on the missing in owner and deadline information. The clarification questions would be who will own the creation of the dashboard and what is the deadline for completing the dashboard. So this email would be reviewed by a human and then eventually be sent out to the team. This is a neat way I wanted to integrate clarification follow-ups after a meeting notes review. This is the behavior I want. The action item is not lost, but it is also not pushed into the final task database. This is really an important design choice. Unclear work should be captured and it should not become accountable work until the missing details are fixed. Let's move to the next task. So now let's test whether the workflow can avoid creating unnecessary tasks from random meeting discussions, which may be important for the context, but they're not actionable in sense. So let's look at the third test case. The transcript here says that the previous launch performed better than the expected, and the team agreed that the learnings were useful for future planning. This is great, but there is no specific follow-up action. No one is assigned anything, no deadline is mentioned. So this is a useful meeting context, but it is not a task. The expected result is that no final task should be created. Depending on the validation logic, the workflow may classify this as a discussion only, no task found, or not a task. But in this case, I didn't create a pathway for this kind of scenario, so the workflow should abruptly stop in middle and no task could be created. So let's quickly execute the workflow and click on the process meeting button for this particular row. And as you can see, the workflow is starting here. It's generated, and yeah, so you can see here, create clarification review T item gets failed here because the fields are all empty because there's no decision item in this particular transcript. So none of this information is pulled. So there is no task to be created. So the workflow fails at this point. We can go to the N8N screen and check if there is any new task created. As we can see, there is no new task created in this page. Let's just reiterate my point that if AI turns every discussion point into a task, then the review queue becomes very much cluttered and there's a lot of chaos in the task workflow. And if the review queue becomes cluttered, people stop trusting it. So filtering non-tasks information is almost as important as extracting the information. Now let's move to the second workflow. This workflow is called the approved task processor workflow. The purpose of this workflow is simple. It only processes tasks that have been reviewed and approved by humans. The trigger here is a typical Notion-based trigger. Whenever a review item changes status to approved, this workflow starts. So let's go to the Notion uh, task review queue database. And in this view, you can see that there are a few sample tasks created with review status, needs clarification and pending review. So if you click on this approve task button, the workflow we just saw, the approve task workflow gets triggered. So let's click on this button. The first step is to fetch approved task details from Notion. At this point, the data is already cleaned and validated by the human reviewer. So this workflow is much simpler than the extraction workflow. Next, I map the fields from the review item to the final tasks. For example, the task name becomes the final task title. The owner becomes the assignee. Deadline becomes the due date. Context and decision summary can be added to the description. Then I create the task in the final task database using this node. For this demo, I'm keeping it inside Notion for simplicity, but it could also be expanded to Notion, ClickUp, Asana, or any other tool for that matter. After creating the task, I update the original review item. So first, let me show you how a created task is shown in the task created database called project tasks in this case. So you can see the task has been created in the Notion database. After the task is created, I update the original review queue item. So let's go back to the review queue database and check how the review status is shown in this thing. You can see it is shown as created. So I change the status to created and the link for the original task is final task is also stored in the created task link field. This creates a clear connection between the suggestion and the actual task. Finally, I log this event in the Google Sheets. So now I have as a record that this task moved from approved to created. The key idea here is separation. The workflow does not deal with messy transcripts or AI outputs. It only deals with approved, structured data. That makes it reliable and easy to maintain. Now, let's look at the third workflow. This one handles rejected tasks, so it's called the rejection handling workflow. Let's click on the workflow. Whenever a review item is marked as rejected, this workflow runs. So the trigger is again a Notion trigger. You can see, so if we go to the Notion database task review queue, we can see in the pending task view that there is still a sample task which with status needs clarification. So in this case, if we give a reason for rejection and reject this task, the rejection handling workflow should be triggered. So let's give something like this is a test rejection, and basically just click on the reject task button. Now, this workflow should be executed shortly, and you can see that the first step is to capture the rejection details. This includes the task name, context, and optionally the rejection reason. The rejection reason is important. It helps improve the system over time. For example, if many tasks are rejected because they are not actually actionable, that tells me extraction prompt needs improvement. Next, I update the review item to mark it as closed. I might also store additional metadata like who rejected it and when. Then I log the rejection in Google Sheets. This gives me a visibility into how many tasks are being rejected and why. Optionally, this workflow could also send a notification. For example, it could notify the person who uploaded the transcript that certain tasks were rejected. For this MVP, I'm keeping it simple and focusing on logging. The key idea here is that rejection is not failure, it is feedback. And by capturing the feedback, the system becomes better over time. So that brings us to the end of the demo. What you must have seen is not just an AI feature, but a complete workflow that turns messy meeting conversations into structured, accountable work. Instead of relying on memory, scattered notes, or manual follow ups, this system creates a clear path from discussions to decisions to execution. The key takeaway here is not just automation, but controlled automation. Helps interpret and extract meaning from unstructured conversations. The workflow ensures that the only high quality validated tasks move forward, and the human stays in control by reviewing and approving what actually matters. This balance is what makes the system practical and trustworthy in real world use cases. If you're building an internal tools, managing teams, or trying to reduce operational friction, this kind of workflow can save time, errors, and improve accountability across the boards. Thanks for watching, and I hope this gives you a clear idea of how you can combine AI with structured workflows to build systems that actually work in practice.